Buenos días, bienvenidos todos a la conferencia que impartirán la doctora Edelgard Wulfert y el doctor James Broussard. Antes de comenzar la conferencia quisiera hacer una presentación de una semblanza de los dos conferencistas que nos distinguen el día de hoy. Es para mí un verdadero honor presentarles. Quiero decirles que la doctora Edelgard Wulfert tiene una trayectoria brillante tanto en el campo de la investigación como en el campo clínico. Ella, con mucho orgullo, quiero decir que es egresada de licenciatura en eso de Guadalajara, para posteriormente haber desarrollado en la Universidad de Norte de Carolina, en Greensboro, su maestría y su doctorado, en donde su tutor fue el doctor Steve Hayes, y del doctorado el doctor Steve Hayes y el doctor Richard Schull. Y bueno, ella tiene una trayectoria importante, no solo en el ámbito de investigación y clínico, sino también en el ámbito de el trabajo en la universidad administrativo. Les puedo decir, para mencionar solo algunos aspectos, que de 2000 a 2004 fue investigadora asociada del Centro de Estrés y Ansiedad en la Universidad de Albany, profesora de psicología, por supuesto, de la Universidad de Albany, jefa del Departamento de Psicología en la Universidad de Albany del 2003 al 2007, Dean activa en el Colegio de Artes y Ciencias también en Albany, Dean del Colegio de Artes y Ciencias del 2008 al 2018, vicepresidente senior de aspectos académicos en Albany, y bueno, ha sido una profesora distinguida en su servicio. Quiero mencionar que sus intereses de investigación se centran en los déficits en la autorregulación, particularmente en el área de juego patológico y el abuso de alcohol. Realizó trabajos básicos y aplicados. Su investigación básica se centra en la elucidación del papel de la excitación fisiológica, la reactividad de las señales, el estrés y las distorsiones cognitivas en los comportamientos adictivos. Su investigación aplicada consiste en estudios de evaluación y tratamiento y está centrándose casi exclusivamente en el juego patológico, porque este trastorno nos permite estudiar el comportamiento adictivo en su forma más pura, es decir, sin los efectos de confusión que generan las sustancias. Ha desarrollado y actualmente está probando la eficacia de una innovadora terapia cognitivo-motivacional conductual para jugadores patológicos, y su objetivo es mejorar nuestra comprensión conceptual de la adicción, incluido su tratamiento, el mantenimiento de las ganancias del tratamiento y el proceso de recaída, que es muy común en este campo. Por otra parte, también quiero presentar con mucho gusto al doctor James Broussard. Él es exalumno de la doctora Wulfert, pero actualmente es profesor asistente de psicología en la Universidad del Estado Jackson State. Su trabajo involucra esfuerzos teóricos y aplicados para expandir el uso de la tecnología dentro de la salud conductual, aspecto muy importante y fuerte en estos momentos. El propósito de estos esfuerzos es aumentar el acceso a intervenciones efectivas de salud conductual para las poblaciones desatendidas, comunidades minoritarias de bajos ingresos y rurales. Específicamente, aboga por métodos de aprendizaje experiencial en mHealth y otras intervenciones digitales con énfasis en el tratamiento de trastornos adictivos, incluido el trastorno de juego, por supuesto. Con esto no quiero decir abundar más. Dejo con ustedes la palabra de nuestros distinguidos conferencistas. Please go ahead. It's your turn.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. And Everardo, thank you very, very much for this very generous introduction. I am extremely pleased to be here and to be able to talk about our research in the area of gambling disorder. Unfortunately, I can only hope that you will not hear the tremendous noise that I am currently hearing in the background, because somebody just came by who is mowing our lawn. And this had to happen right now. So I hope this will not disturb you too much. Also, I hope, I wish my Spanish would be still as good as it once was when I was at the ITESO. Unfortunately, after so many years, it is not good enough anymore. And for that reason, I have decided to give the presentation in English and not in Spanish. And I hope you will forgive me for that. All right, so let me get started. My colleague James and we will be talking to you about cognitive, behavioral, and experiential intervention for gambling disorder. And so I'm going to give you a brief introduction about gambling disorder, and then discuss or present 3 clinical trials that we conducted with a treatment that was developed in our lab called cognitive motivational behavior therapy. And after that, James will present to you some experimental research that we have conducted in order to focus on a particular area that we believe is crucial in maintaining gambling problems. Okay, and so then after that, I hope we will still have a little bit of time to answer any questions that you might have. James, if you would please present the first slide of my presentation. Okay, so let me start talking to you about the motives for excessive gambling. A lot of people really enjoy gambling, and of course many people do it without making this an excessive problem, because simply people enjoy it. Now we can ask, why are people gambling? And I think for the majority of individuals who do not suffer from a gambling disorder, it simply is the excitement of perhaps winning some money. So people like to play. We are in our area, we have a lot of horse race gambling, but there are also casinos. And so I'm talking about gambling on games of chance, okay? So winning money is one of the major ideas behind gambling. And then, of course, associated with winning money is the excitement and the action that people experience. And a number of people also gamble for social purposes. For example, when you are in a casino, there are table games, you play with other individuals, and so people gamble for fun. However, there's a subset of individuals for whom gambling has gotten out of control, and it has developed into a behavioral addiction. Now, a behavioral addiction, when you go to DSM-5, you will find 10 different points that would be common in an individual who suffers from addictive behavior. And this is actually not so unusual or it's not so different from many other addictions as well. So the person who gambles in an addictive way gambles with more and more money in order to achieve the same amount of excitement. The person becomes restless and irritable if the individual is prevented from gambling, for example. The person has made several unsuccessful attempts to stop gambling. And the person often uses gambling as a way of what we call mood repair. When they feel distressed, depressed, anxious, they use gambling. They chase losses. That means they lose a lot and then they go back the next day in order to make up for the losses. And they lie and conceal their gambling. And why? Because, of course, it is a socially unacceptable behavior to waste personal resources and family resources. And most of these individuals also begin to borrow money from friends and from family. They waste money from family resources. and some of them end up embezzling money. So it is a gambling disorder is a very, very significant problem. And depending on the data, it can affect, in the most severe form, 1.5% to 2% of the population in the United States and in Canada. But problem gambling that waxes and wanes may affect 5% of the population. So it is definitely a very significant problem. Next slide, please. So now, what does the research literature tell us about gambling? First of all, compared to the treatment of other addictive disorders, the gambling literature still is in its infancy. When you go to the literature, you see that the most common and best supported treatments are cognitive behavior therapy and motivational interviewing. So both of these treatments have significant support. However, there's a major problem associated with that literature, and that is a very high dropout rate. So in some of the studies, particularly the earlier studies, one saw that up to 50 or 60% of individuals drop out from treatment. And of course, when people drop out from treatment, well, you cannot treat them, and then you can also not help them. And that is combined with a second problem, that is that many, many gamblers don't seek treatment at all, and they only seek treatment because somebody now really forced them into treatment. For example, a spouse who said, I'm going to divorce you, or they got into conflicts with the law. So there is some obligation behind it. So to basically summarize this, the treatment literature is marred by high dropout rates. And this is one of the problems that our research has tried to address. Next slide, please. Okay. So in my lab, we developed a cognitive motivational behavior therapy, or CMBT, which is a multimodal treatment that integrates some of these treatments that I have mentioned that have been shown to be effective: motivational interviewing, cognitive behavior therapy, and behavior therapy. So now the main idea here was we need to do whatever we can to retain individuals in treatment, because again, if they drop out, we cannot help them. And so the first and foremost, the treatment was geared to retain gamblers in treatment. And this is why our treatment started with a so-called MI, a motivational interviewing component. Motivational interviewing is different from the typical approach that has traditionally been used when you deal with addiction, when the idea is that somehow you need to break through denial and you need to, it's almost as if you were trying to hit people over the head and to break through the denial. And that is exactly what drives individuals away. So motivational interviewing is a completely different approach that starts with empathy for the individuals with an addictive disorder. And so the purpose here is to raise their awareness that their behavior is really causing havoc in their lives. And so, but you're raising awareness, and you're trying to guide the client to the conviction that they not only need to do something about the problem, but they want to do something about the problem. So this is the first basically component, and we use up to three sessions, if need be more. If people are already ready to really work on their problem, it could be less, but we start with motivational interviewing. And it is precisely this component that has allowed us to enlist clients, to engage them in treatment, so that our dropout rate, as you will see, has been very low. Once we have people really engaged in treatment, now we are using active components with which we try to target their false beliefs. the high-risk situations that present triggers for their gambling, and so on and so forth. So particularly, we address the cognitive biases. People believe, they do not understand that the rate of return in gambling is always negative. That means the longer you gamble, the more money you're going to lose. And for that reason, we are targeting particularly all these different cognitive biases and false beliefs that people hold. And then finally, another very important component is the behavior therapy component, because we teach people alternative skills, how they can deal with negative emotions. We use relapse prevention and skills building and alternatives. Together, the entire treatment consists of 12 sessions, and we can add booster sessions. But for research purposes, we limited it to 12 sessions. And I'm now going to show you the data from 3 trials. The next slide, please, James. The very first trial that we did was CMBT versus treatment as usual, TAU. And as you can see, this was, we are working here in Albany in a treatment center. Okay, this is not done at the university, this is in a treatment center. And just very briefly, if you can see, we had 9 clients that we enlisted in this pilot study, and we compared them to 12 individuals in TAU. Our retention was 100%, the retention in TAU was 75%, which is actually very good. Now, when you look, the SARCS is the Southeast Gambling Scale, a scale from 0 to 20. You look at the pre and then the post numbers, and you can see that our treatment, the CMBT, has significantly decreased the gambling, whereas when you look at the data from TAU, you see that they have very little decreased and they are still in the clinical range. So this was a significant difference. We only had follow-up data for our own treatment, and we could say that basically the treatment effects were maintained. When you look at the DSM criteria, it's the same. There are up to, the criteria are from 0 to 10. You can see pre, the 2 groups were comparable. At post, our group in CMBT significantly decreased, and we were able to maintain the treatment. So this was very, very good. And based on these data, we applied for federal funding, and we received significant amounts of money from our federal government, from the NIMH, and we're able then to conduct a couple more treatments. James, the next slide, please. The second treatment, and this was now a randomized clinical trial where we randomized individuals to CMBT or to Gamblers Anonymous, because of course it is assumed that GA, Gamblers Anonymous, is an effective treatment. We had 23 individuals in each group, and now you see, for example, that in our CMBT we had 1 person who only attended the first session of our treatment and never came back. 22 individuals, or 96%, attended all our sessions, and we lost 1 person to follow up. When you compare that to the GA, 10 individuals never attended or attended 1 GA session and basically dropped out. 5 of them went to all the 12 treatment sessions that we asked them to attend, and 8 were lost to follow up. So now when you look, the graph here shows you the DSM diagnosis, okay, after from the beginning of treatment through a post and 3 and 6 months follow-up. Now, at the beginning, of course, everybody 100% was meeting diagnostic criteria. The blue line is CMBT treatment, and as you can see, we have significantly decreased the diagnosis. So very few individuals in the end still met diagnostic criteria in CMBT, whereas individual in GA, basically most of them still maintained the diagnosis. In other words, they did not really become better. And so we did a repeated measures ANOVA for an intent to treat analysis, and undoubtedly, and you can see that here already on the graph, the CMBT was better. Change the next slide, please. And here, what these two figures show you is the amount of dollars people had gambled and the number of days people had gambled. Without going into too much detail here, the broken line is GA, the full line is our treatment. Since there was a huge individual difference in terms of the amount of money gambled and the number of days gambled, we used a percentage of prior treatment, and then the graphs here show you by what percentage individuals reduced the number of dollars gambled and the number of days gambled. And so you can see very clearly on these two graphs that there was a significant difference. So the people in GMBT gambled significantly less in terms of money and also in terms of the days. So the conclusion here is that our treatment undoubtedly showed a significant improvement over GA. I would, however, like to point out that the 5 individuals who attended GA on a regular basis also did very, very well. So it doesn't mean that there's only one treatment that works. What matters is that people stay with treatment. And of course, many dropped out from GA. So CMBT clearly was superior. The next slide, please. And this is the last trial that I wanted to briefly mention. We now compared CMBT to CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, which is the gold standard. And as you see, we had 30 patients in CMBT and 32 in CBT. If you look at the retention from pre to post, so this is 12 sessions, okay, there was already a difference because we retained 80% and CBT retained only 55%. And that was the same thing was true after 12 months. We retained over an entire year. We did follow up. Okay, we retained 70% and the same 55% were retained in CBT. So this was a significant difference. 70% to 55%. However, when you look at other things such as the DSM criteria, there was no difference between the two treatments. Those who were retained in treatment, again, this is an intent to treat analysis, those who were retained in treatment in either way, in either CMBT or CBT did not differ. The only difference was that CBT lost more patients, so they were able to help fewer patients. The next slide, please. And here again, you see the number of dollars gambled and the number of days gambled, and you see from the graphs there were no statistically significant differences. So CMBT and CBT work equally well. The only difference is in CMBT, probably through the effects of MI, we engaged people more into treatment in the beginning and we retained more. So that was so far the only significant difference. The next slide, please. So just to summarize the findings from comparing the treatment that we developed with treatment as usual, Gamblers Anonymous and CBT. CMBT is undoubtedly superior in retaining gamblers in treatment than the other 3 treatments, but it is equally effective than the other treatments for gamblers who are retained in treatment, regardless of be it GA or CBT, okay? Few gamblers in all of our treatments maintain total abstinence. They significantly decrease number of days gambled, number of dollars used gambling. Some are completely abstinent, but many continue to gamble, which always poses a risk, okay? Now, as I had pointed out, gamblers do not understand the concept of the negative rate of return. Now, of course, we explain that, we give them many examples, but it is not the same. They always believe somehow experientially that it is a difference for them. They are the lucky ones, okay? And so this gave us the idea that we need to change our intervention, or we need to do something in order to provide a more experimental understanding, because this might lead to more lasting change. And I am now turning it over to James so that he can talk to you about precisely this intervention.
Thank you. Thank you, Elga. So I was very fortunate in the final trial to be assigned to the cognitive motivational behavioral therapy arm of the intervention. And my background was in technology to a certain extent. So I had been a member of the United States Air Force in a very tech-heavy field. And I'm kind of just a tinkerer. I like to create things. I like to program. And I had noticed that while the motivational interviewing module of CMBT had a really strong effect, as you can see, and went quite well, and people responded to it, when we got to the cognitive module and trying to convince gamblers of their biases was sometimes effective, but definitely more marginally effective just from direct experience with the clients. Very difficult to convince them. And so, as Elga was saying, we have lots of different ways to demonstrate the gambler's fallacy or the illusion of control. So we flip quarters, we pull marbles, you know, a bag of 100 marbles and 3 are white, and we pull marbles until you get the color marble to demonstrate these ideas about the rate of return and percentages and odds. I can tell you that some gamblers are able to understand these things. Many, in fact, come in with an understanding of odds, and yet they gamble anyway excessively. And others are not able to comprehend these more abstract concepts. And so when we think about this and we have our supervision sessions, we say the reason that this is they've contacted the short-term contingencies of gambling. And in the short term, there are many wins. So individuals derive a rule which says, if I gamble, I will have wins, which is true. But the amount, the magnitude of wins will not overcome the smaller but more frequent losses that occur as an individual bets. Typically, many types of gambling, it's a fixed amount that they risk with the possibility of a larger magnitude win. And in fact, sometimes they even experience jackpots. So what we're fighting with is the verbal rules that individuals have developed about two different contingencies, the short-term contingency and then the more long-term contingencies. And it's very much more difficult for them to derive accurate rules because of that short-term contingency. So what we need is a different experiential approach to help them understand the long-term outcomes and consequences, which can then inform the rules that they create and also their behavior in the real world. And we relate this to both behavior analytic theory and to a lesser extent experiential learning theory. If any of you have not come across experiential learning theory, I highly recommend it. And in fact, I have a couple of papers written about the use of experiential learning theory in practice of cognitive behavioral therapy. So the intervention that we developed, the experiential approach, ultimately became something we call the Brief Digital Accelerator Treatment for Gambling. And this is a free resource that you can access online. You just Google the name and you can get a hold of it from the VA South Central MIREC. That's the Veterans Affairs organization that I was a part of when we developed this. Now, the first step to establishing this approach was to create a simple analog to test whether a experiential intervention involving gambling on the individual's preferred method of gambling would actually change the rules that they develop to impact later behavior. And so in the first study, we just did this in a sample of college students, many who had experience with slot machines, though not all. And we developed this simple digital interface where they could play a 3-reel slot machine on the computer and to simulate wins and losses as they can observe in the amount paid and their total credits. But in this experiential intervention, we added 2 additional components to help individuals understand the long-term outcomes. So you could either play 1 trial or 1 spin at a time and bet your 3 quarters and observe the outcome, or you could bet 50 trials all at the same time, and the simulator would provide graphical and numerical displays of the outcomes of all 50 trials. And so when a person is playing 50 spins or 50 trials at a time, they can go through thousands of gambling outcomes in a matter of minutes and start to understand through looking at the graphical interface and also the numerical displays what the long-term outcomes or contingency actually is. So you see, we have, in a sense, almost multiple contingencies going on. There's the short-term, within session experiences that people have, and then there is the long-term, the tying together of all gambling sessions. And because for many different reasons, most people derive their rules based on those within session experiences. No one ever puts together all the sessions into a continuous line. Well, that's what we do with the gambling accelerator. It's an unbroken line that joins every single experience, whereas most people might play 100, 200, 300 bets within a given, hour or 2 of playing. We can simulate months of different, if you want to call them sessions of gambling in an unbroken line. And the outcome with this first experiment was to show that when we provide the information to people in a handout and explain all the odds and all the long-term outcomes and how they're not good, they're typically negative, or when we simply let them play the simulator for several thousand trials, both individuals, both groups reduce their belief in the chances of winning from pre-intervention to post-intervention. So explaining it or instructing them to adopt a new rule and then providing an experience which encourages adopting a new rule will modify beliefs. And we know this because we see beliefs change in cognitive interventions all the time. But the difference is that when we bring them into a simulated gambling environment with a full simulated casino with sights and sounds and a real slot machine, and we provide them with money to begin playing with the expectation that they could win a big jackpot or come out ahead, the individuals who received the simulated gambling experience on our accelerator stop earlier. Okay, now there's much more to this experiment that I could describe as to why this is important. And in fact, our slot machine that we had in this environment, though it looked completely realistic and behaved like a real slot machine, we've controlled it completely. And all participants got the exact same sequence of wins and losses, which is why we were able to compare across the different groups. So experientially derived rules not only modify the cognitions that people have, but also modify subsequent behavior, or at least modify it better than information alone. So after this first study, we move forward to testing this in a sample of problematic gamblers from the community. Now, these were not individuals that were treatment seeking, but all individuals were either at risk or displayed probable pathological gambling. And in this study, we chose to use individuals that play primarily on scratch-off tickets. So you can see that the average for the study in terms of spending was about $100 every other week and about 7 days of gambling every other week. So basically every other day, these individuals gambled, rather frequent gamblers. And we changed the interface to mimic actual scratch-off tickets that people could buy in their communities, but pretty much the rest of the intervention stayed the same, so they could observe the unbroken graph, they could observe the numerical wins and losses, and the overall amount of expenditures through the simulated gambling scenario. Now, we compared this form of the simulator to an actual brief intervention that is used, and it's brief motivational interviewing, much like what we did in CMBT, but just cut down to a single session. Okay, so the individuals either got brief motivational interviewing, our simulator intervention, or a control group that just read a handout about form, shape, and space. It had nothing to do with gambling. So as we would have expected, controls and motivational interviewing, there was no change in the belief in the chances of winning, and our intervention actually had a very strong effect on belief in the chances of winning. Something that was not necessarily anticipated was that our intervention significantly reduced individuals' urge to gamble. Now, we anticipated that that might happen, but we had also anticipated that motivational interviewing would reduce urges, because we're talking about all the negative outcomes of individuals gambling and how it may not be consistent with their values. You would expect that conversation to somewhat reduce their urge. In fact, it did not. And it was surprising how much that experience on the accelerator reduced the urge. And so, of course, we know that individuals' desire or excitement is either mediated or moderated by their beliefs about the behavior that they're engaging in. And so it's very exciting to think that a simulator, which is pure experience, we do not give them a lot of guidance, we just let them play, can have such a profound effect on so many different systems which impact gambling. But more importantly than that was that when individuals went back to the community and we tracked them for a brief follow-up period of 1 month, it was the individuals that received the accelerator intervention that reduced their gambling amounts spent. And in fact, they also reduced the days of gambling as well. So about 50% as effective or more effective than brief motivational interviewing. Now, due to issues with power, there was no statistically significant difference between brief MI and controls, although we do know that brief MI is an effective intervention. And you can see that there were differences. We just did not have enough participants to show that effect. But still, we've seen now in 2 studies that an experience with the long-term contingencies, which is provided through a digital intervention, can change beliefs and behavior. And this is, we believe, to be more effective than simply instructing people on all these abstract and, sort of complex rules. So I'll give a very quick overview of the materials and the resources that are required to be able to deliver the brief motivation, or excuse me, the brief digital accelerator treatment in its current form, and to show some of the updates that we have created now that it's a packaged intervention which you can download. So first is a workbook that explains the approach, provides all the necessary resources. The second is the Digital Gambling Accelerator program, and this actually operates in Microsoft Excel. So it's using just the standard Microsoft Excel platform to deliver these different effects and to observe outcomes. And so all this intervention requires is the materials and then access to the Excel database, which you can download from the same website where you get the treatment manual. Okay, and of course you can see the link to that right here. Certainly our emails are contained, email addresses are contained on the first slide, and if you would like access or have further questions, you can contact us. So the way that we provide this intervention now is to first conduct an information gathering and brief assessment to figure out what their beliefs are. whether they have more of an illusion of control orientation, meaning, you know, if I have a strategy that I can use, which guarantees that I will win, or we try to determine if they have more of the gambler's fallacy orientation, which says, well, I don't really use a strategy, but with my experience of wins in the past, I know that if I just play long enough, eventually I'll win again and I'll be ahead. So, individuals can have a variety of different beliefs, but those are some of the most common that affect people's gambling from a cognitive, functionally speaking, from a cognitive angle. The next step is to simply give them the chance to experience and play through the accelerator and even to test their strategies. And then finally, we engage in a brief discussion of what their experience was, if they were surprised by anything that they may have learned, very open-ended, very MI focused. And then if they would like to set any goals based on their newfound the knowledge. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the different exercises, because through the research that we conducted, and in fact, a poster that we're now going to be presenting at ABCT, in fact, next week, we find that it's the individuals with the gambler's fallacy and the belief in luck that are particularly impacted by the digital gambling accelerator, because they're relying on this idea that I can win in the long run to maintain their gambling. I just have to play long enough. And in fact, the gambling accelerator directly violates that rule in a very visually descriptive manner. So that is, and expected that people would experience a lot of cognitive and behavioral change if that's their orientation. But the individuals that have an illusion of control, where they think that they have a winning strategy, are less impacted by the digital gambling experience. And this makes sense because we do not give them the opportunity in the first and second study to change strategies, to try new things. And so in the final version of the digital gambling accelerator treatment, we give them lots and lots and lots of different ticket options of different denominations and encourage them. Okay, if you are believing that if you're losing a lot on one ticket, switching to another ticket should provide a win. Let's test that out. Let's see if that is true. And we do it systematically, tracking how many wins and losses you had with one ticket, and then switching to another ticket, how many wins and losses. And in fact, we can simulate this 10, 15, 20 times so that they can basically go through a behavioral experiment or a behavioral test to see if there really is a winning strategy, or if playing higher denomination tickets is the way to go. Because the idea is that they have to be able to test the or experience the accuracy or inaccuracy of these different rules. And it's easier when you have some an operandum, some way that you can actually do this. It would be very difficult, cost prohibitive, in fact, possibly even unethical to have individuals go and actually gamble to discover these things. But we can do this very easily with these simulations. Another thing that we observe is, and future versions of the brief digital accelerator treatment will take advantage of, is it must be with the individual's preferred mode of gambling. So though you can demonstrate principles of gambling in general and the negative rate of return with scratch-off tickets, change in beliefs and behavior will typically only occur if the individual is primarily a scratch-off ticket or a slot machine gambler, and it becomes more complex to create these sorts of simulations for games like blackjack or sports betting. So I'm a clinical scientist, and I use the BDAT with lots of different individuals that I treat on a weekly basis, and I can tell you that my sports gamblers are not particularly affected by talking about scratch-off tickets, because their idea is it's their knowledge and their superiority that leads to the ability to win. And so we will be continuing to modify so that every individual experiences the actual preparation, gambling preparation, in which they initially derived their erroneous beliefs or the erroneous rules. And again, this all goes back to behavior analytic theory. You want individuals to have be in the same environment when they are adopting new rules. They can't be in a different environment, and that goes back to principles of learning and renewal and lots of different theoretical concepts which influence how people learn. So I give a quick overview of the final discussion and goal setting session. We ask individuals, of course, to re-rate their beliefs so that we can track change, and to engage in a SMART goals planning exercise, hopefully so that they can not only provide a new way of thinking about the chances, but to make some commitments to change based on that information. Of course, we know when individuals commit in that moment, they are somewhat more likely to actually adhere to those commitments than if we do not have this discussion. There's some different resources for you, including information from the National Council on Problem Gambling and the Gamblers Anonymous website, as Dr. Wulfert showed, that we are not saying that any one intervention is necessarily so vastly superior that it should be the sole focus, but that individuals, gamblers particularly, need lots of different interventions as they may relate more to one intervention than another. What's most important is being able to retain them and keep them engaged. And I would say that is the last component of the Brief Digital Accelerator treatment. It's highly engaging, and I can guarantee you the discussions of marbles and flipping quarters is not so engaging, or at least not for me. Maybe some people really relate well to those things, but I've yet to have a gambler who is not interested in the accelerator visual exercise. So that is it for our presentation. I believe that we now have an opportunity to answer some questions.
Thank you very much to both of us, both of you. And here we have a lot of questions. I'm gonna give you some of them. The first one is, should we always ask the gamblers to generate their own set of rules after exposing them to contingency of the simulation, or should we induce the rules?
Mm-hmm. So our understanding, and based on just clinical skill, is to guide them using open-ended questions and Socratic dialogue to articulate these rules themselves based on the experience. And if we go back, that's why that model of experiential learning theory is so important. Provide them with the opportunity for observation, then engage in reflective, back onto what happened here when you started to have more losses, what was happening. And then through abstract reasoning, they were able to then, codify what that experience was, to maybe say, wow, in the long run, you really can't win. But that needs to be generated by them as much as possible. Although we use all our standard cognitive cognitive intervention skills to highlight those certain rules or those certain experiences.
Yeah, let me just emphasize that as well. I do think, we know that from the literature that in a way self-generated rules are more believable to the individual than externally imposed rules. After all, they have followed their self-generated rules for a long time. And now, and the skill is, and this is also the skill of the person who does the intervention, that you are guiding an individual to generate correct rules that correctly describe the contingencies. And when they can develop them themselves, I think then it becomes integrated and more believable to themselves. So, yeah.
Okay, and at the beginning of the presentation in the clinical trials, you emphasized the motivation part of the therapy. And now in this kind of research, you emphasize the beliefs. What is the importance, theoretical and concept importance, but for those variables in the explanation of the changing of the gambler's behavior?
Okay. I think those of you who are familiar with an intervention such as motivational interviewing, you know, or a cognitive intervention, basically there is a correlation between what we say to ourselves and what we do. Now, individuals, obviously, like gamblers, they lie, they think one thing and they say another thing, okay, but in general, what guides our behavior is the consistency between what we believe and what we do. And so the importance of motivational interviewing is to raise a person's awareness and to change little by little the beliefs that they have been held, that they have been holding for a long time, so that basically different types of beliefs correspond to different types of behavior. I think it's perfectly consistent with a behavioral analysis to say that there is a reciprocal relationship between what we think and what we do, and also how we feel. I mean, these three things go together. Now, I cannot reach into a person's mind or brain and change their beliefs, but I can use my verbal behavior. I can question beliefs and then provide experiences that allow the beliefs to change. And that's what James just demonstrated with his experiential intervention. But of course, that's not the only way in which we can change beliefs. I mean, we can also change beliefs by talking to someone, by questioning someone, by pointing out what the consequences of behavior are and how their beliefs are in a way contradicted by what is happening in their lives. I mean, that's what therapy is all about. That's what we are trying to do, you know. And so, I mean, from that perspective, I mean, what is called motivational interviewing is simply an intervention that is non-threatening to the person, where you are not attacking an individual or scolding them or telling them what they should or should not be doing, but rather you are trying in a similar way to the experiential intervention. You're trying to lead a person to begin to question the assumptions and the beliefs they hold, so that that might translate itself into a different behavior. And that's, after all, the goal of therapy.
Okay, thank you. Have you tried the accelerator in some kind of prevention with no pathological gamblers, but people at risk? And if you do that, what was the results?
So the second study was with individuals from the community, and many were at risk or probable pathological gamblers that did not seek treatment. Okay, and some had ideas, and we asked those questions. You know, have you considered treatment? Is you thought this is a problem? Many did not. I can tell you that there was one individual whose gambling on scratch-off tickets was so severe that they were not able to pay their bills, and yet they had not really considered getting help for it. And they talked about how it was such a problem, and but they just had to keep playing because eventually you'd get that win. I happened to be the person providing the intervention that day, and as they saw the line go down and down and down, this individual immediately recognized what she had been doing for all this time and why she was not able to win. And when that happened, she became physically ill and had to leave the session because she was able to contact the more accurate contingency in a way that she had not been able to before. And this individual stopped gambling. Now, she sought out help, and that was not part of our study. Of course, we gave resources, but she quit gambling. And so I just think that speaks to the power of giving this transformative experience, potentially transformative experience.
Mm-hmm. I think you know the field of temporal discount. Do you think this kind of studies can be a good strategy to diagnose people with a risk of pathology gambling?
I mean, I am familiar, of course, with temporal discounting, and what we basically temporal discounting is a measure of impulsivity. And keep in mind, gambling disorder at some point was classified as an impulse control disorder before it was reclassified as an addictive disorder. And so, like, we have used discounting approaches just from an assessment purpose to see whether there's a relationship that people who are more impulsive would be more difficult to treat. Because, of course, impulsivity is like you could call it a personality dimension. This is not something that you can treat very easily. You know, you can move it a little bit toward the middle, but I don't think that you are making a very relaxed person of somebody who is very impulsive. But Everardo, I did not understand what exactly the question was in terms of temporal discounting and how that related to what we were doing.
The measures of temporal discounting, like research to diagnose pathological gambling.
Okay, right. Again, I don't think it would be useful to diagnose pathological gambling, but it is useful to establish an underlying personality dimension that would make people more prone toward all kinds of impulsive behavior. And I always say, you know, there are underlying dimensions that can shift us in this way or that way. The behavioral manifestation of the underlying dimension depends on the environment in which you live. You know, if you have never been exposed to gambling, you will not end up becoming a gambler. But maybe you drink too much, you use drugs, or you shop too much, whatever. I mean, there are other dimensions that one can. I would say the temporal discounting is not specific to any particular what we would call disorder. It just measures an underlying propensity or dimension that may sometimes be actually positive, because, you know, risk taking can also be a positive trait. But it can also show that this is a person who is inclined toward making impulsive decisions.
Okay. There is a comment that the accelerator sounds like a very good advance using the technology, but what is your opinion? Because the technology is too advancing in promote the gambling behavior with the iPhones for adolescents. You don't have to go to casinos now. You can have gambling immediately. What do you think about this kind of new phenomena, and how will the impact in the percent of population that will have pathology gambling in the future?
So we have studies, just naturalistic studies, to show that when they build a casino in a place that did not have access before, issues go up. There is more problem gambling because it relates to access. Well, the idea is that the immediate availability, as long as you have smartphone and internet connection, is that prevalence rates are going to increase. Now, my personal opinion and the way I look at it is through the idea of informed consumerism. You are telling a person, or even encouraging them, that you're going to hit the jackpot. Okay, you are selling a product, and the product you sell is fun and the chance of winning money. Should there not be some responsibility to actually show people in an accurate and understandable way what the actual rate of return is? So I could certainly think that having an accelerator put into a little space next to the "Are you a problem gambler" phone number would be pretty responsible of these different organizations that provide gambling. Now, is that ever going to happen? We'll see.
Okay. Thank you for your answer.
There is even something else, not just gambling, but also gaming.
Yeah.
I mean, young people, I see that. I mean, we both, James and I, we work at universities, and we can see that with young individuals, there are these multiplayer games. I am currently in private practice treating a young person, I mean, who has almost lost his entire academic career over getting involved in gaming, where no money is involved. So, I mean, it is very true with digital access to so many opportunities, be it gaming or gambling. No, I mean, we are almost educating, you can say, an entire generation on getting seriously involved with these digital phenomena. Yeah, it's dangerous.
Right. There is a comment about your work. Is very clear and very, very good. And they comment that it's not common to show some clinical research combined with application. How do you do that, and what problems have you confront to mix these areas?
Well, let me say something in the beginning. As a professor, I assembled outstanding graduate students around me. James was one of them, and you see he's a very successful professor now. I think, I had a big lab, and so all my students did experimental research, and then at the same time we had federal funding to really do the clinical research. So the two things go hand in hand, and I think it's just enjoying what we are doing. And James, you are doing probably the same thing now, no?
I am now part of the Upright Lab, Underserved Populations Research Integrating Technology and Experience, but I work in a historically Black university, at HBCU, and the idea is that we can use these interventions to help individuals in places that cannot traditionally access the type of care like a protocol like CMBT, but we can use technology and experiential applications through smartphones to do this. And that's my passion, is to take all the things that we know from the university, from the R1s, and figure out how to deliver it to the communities that can't get to the university or to the clinics or to the big hospitals, and so this is the wave of the future and what I'm extremely passionate about.
That's a good bet. Yes. Well, the people is interested in your papers. Maybe if you can send me the presentation with the references, I can share to the audience. Well, sure. Now we're going to end this presentation. We don't have more questions. Thank you very much for your collaboration. Thank you very much, and I send you a big hug. See you.
Thank you very much. Take care.